Okay, hi and welcome to another webinar in our summer series. And I would like to introduce you to our speaker today, Dr. Claire O'Callaghan. She's a senior lecturer in English at Loughborough University, UK. Her research interests are in Victorian literature and culture and New Victorian studies. Claire's research typically focuses on gender, identity, violence, and more recently, health. She's an expert on the writings of the historical novelist Sarah Waters and the lives and works of Brontë. Claire is the author of Sarah Waters, Gender and Sexual Politics, and Emily Brontë Reappraised, and she's the editor-in-chief of Brontë Studies. Welcome to the webinar, Dr. O'Callaghan.
Hi. Thank you so much, Aria, and thank you, and a massive thank you to Sophie, to you, Aria, and to Curtis for inviting me to the Literature and Science Forum. I'm really pleased to be able to share some of my work in progress today. This is part of an ongoing piece I've been working on. It's taken me far longer than I anticipated because I'm silly and I do multiple projects at the same time, so I need to stop and just finish one. Because I'm also technically inept, Sophie is going to be moving my slides forward. So thank you, Sophie. I'll give you a little prompt every time I want you to do that, if that's okay. As I said, this is a work in progress, so please do feel free to give me feedback, ask questions, or get in touch afterwards via my email or social media. Two little things to say before I get into the paper. One, as you can probably tell from the title, I'm talking about a real life figure, her real life experiences of ill health. I'm talking about the body and sickness. I'm talking about death, and I'm going to show you an image of a bloodied handkerchief. If those are going to be, content warning for you, if that's going to be a trigger, then please feel free to just listen to the audio and not watch my slides at all. And then the other thing I wanted to say before I start is, I have a dog and some cats, and they tend to come in and out and make noise, and I apologise in advance for them being ridiculous as well. So let me get going. So in early December 1848, the Victorian poet and novelist Anne Brontë, who's the youngest of the infamous Brontë sisters, began to display symptoms of tuberculosis, or consumption, as it was then known. Writing of her sister's illness in personal correspondence, Charlotte Brontë, the eldest sibling and author of Jane Eyre, described how, at that time, Anne had a cold and a cough, felt weak, and was experiencing frequent pain in the side. Sophie, if you could move me on. Thank you. So on the left here, you've got an X-ray from the Wellcome collection. This is showing what tuberculosis looks like in the lungs with the benefits of today's technology. And on the right is a image of Anne's bloodied handkerchief that's kept at the Brontë Parsonage Museum in Haworth. I was hoping to show you some video of that material because I was looking at this item at the parsonage just again last week, and but unfortunately the size of the file and all kinds of problems conspired to make that not possible. But what I will say about this handkerchief is it's this handkerchief and seeing it on display that really sparked my interest in this, even though this research also follows on from other research I've done on tuberculosis. And it's a really fascinating piece. We know that it's been laundered. And the blood has seeped through on both sides. And when you have it out, it's a really quite a big handkerchief, and you can see that there are lots of spots. You can see that a lot of the coughing that's happened, and you can see that actually, despite the laundering that's taken place, there's far more blood on it than maybe appears initially. All of this is to kind of set up a meeting place between the past and the present when it comes to illness. Because today we understand that tuberculosis is a highly contagious infection of the lungs that impacts the body's organs and circulatory system. And it's not only treatable, using a standard 6-month course of 4 different antibiotics, but it's also preventable through vaccination, which of course didn't exist back in the 19th century. And as you might imagine, in the 1840s, the situation was incredibly different. In fact, at that time, empirical insights into the cause of the disease were speculative, treatments were largely ineffective, beliefs about a predisposition to tuberculosis and to kind of other forms of illness were rampant. And the idea that Anne Brontë was predisposed to it comes up a lot in Brontë biography, as I'll come back to. Debates about the curability or the incurability of tuberculosis were also diverse. And that meant that some medical practitioners at the time believed that the ability to cure a patient of tuberculosis was directly connected to the extent to which the disease was established, and that's the word that's used, established in the patient's body. As the historian Florent Condra has explored in some of his writing on the history of tuberculosis in the 19th century, framing any discussion of medical success and efficacy with regards to treatments from the present day is really quite complicated, because the debates about what success looked like, what cures looked like, were different according to different practitioners. I'm going to come back to that idea through the course of the talk. Sophie, if you could kindly move me on. Thank you. So tragically, Anne's illness was another case of Brontë sickness in the parsonage household across the years 1848 and 1849. So Branwell Brontë, whose image is drawn in the middle here, the siblings' often maligned brother, he died following a short illness in September 1848. His death certificate says he died of chronic bronchitis or marasmus, which is basically a wasting disease. But many biographers often speak about that in terms of, again, tuberculosis. So there becomes some slippage in terms of different forms of chest-related illnesses in the subsequent handling of that information. And Emily Brontë, the author of Wuthering Heights, who in the image on the left, the pillar portrait, is the second one in from the left. She had become symptomatic with tuberculosis in October 1848, and she'd passed away at home on the 19th of December in that year, just as Anne began to display symptoms. So that means then that Anne, her other sister Charlotte, and their father Patrick Brontë, who you can see here, were all grieving at this time as Anne becomes ill. It's a really heightened emotional context for all of the family, and it's probably really difficult, but to kind of imagine just how vulnerable and tender they all were, having gone through this kind of successive illnesses, just to then find out that Anne is also becoming ill. And I think it's also fair to say that at that time, none of them could have known that just 6 months later, on Friday the 25th of May in 1849, Anne would travel to Scarborough to embrace a change of air and the resort's waters, but that by the Monday she too would be dead. Now, moving from that point of departure, so this research kind of draws on the surviving correspondence we have written by Charlotte and Anne during the last 6 months of Anne's life. And I want to rethink the dominant narrative we have about Anne's experience, which is commonly conceptualized as one of passivity. So I aim to show in this paper that despite the persistent argument made by many Brontë scholars that Anne resigned herself to death from the moment of her diagnosis in January onwards, that it isn't really quite the case, and actually it's far more complicated than we might think. Through a close reading of the Brontë letters, I want to demonstrate that although Charlotte, her sister, fluctuates between feelings of hope and despair for Anne's ill health, and Charlotte is painfully situated as a helpless, emotional onlooker during Anne's illness, any suggestion that Anne accepted her fate is really a misrepresentation of her diagnosis and the prognosis she received, and that it erroneously perpetuates what I'm kind of informally calling the death sentence myth. And the death sentence myths, there's no other way to call it, and you'll see why when I put up some quotes later. It's a myth that I think is cultivated both by misreadings of the Brontes' letters, coupled with the legacy of Charlotte's posthumous editing and titling of Anne's final poem, which have together produced this received story that Anne's response to consumption was both submissive and uncomplaining. As I hope to show to the contrary, Anne was actually really pragmatic about her diagnosis. She engaged in all forms of available treatment to her at the time, and that she's even optimistic about a cure. And that if we carefully read the Brontes' surviving correspondence, we can actually see that so was the medical doctor that was treating her as well. So crucial to this is very much keeping in mind and understanding that how we look at tuberculosis today and the kind of treatments we have that I mentioned and the scientific knowledge we have of how to identify and all of those things is incredibly different to the 19th century, and that everything we think we know about tuberculosis today was a matter of debate at that time when Anne's sick. And then it's for that reason, if we can contextualize it in this kind of emerging science, emerging medicine at the time, that we can see why Anne and her doctor might have been a bit more optimistic for a cure. Sophie, move me on. The three people who are recipients, in fact, move me on again. There are three recipients of the letters in question I'm referring to. One was the Bronte's friend on the left here, Ellen Nussey. And the others are George Smith and William Smith Williams, who are part of the siblings publishers. So in context, which is where I want to start, Sophie, the behaviour and actions of both Charlotte and Anne are, in my view, reactive in part to Emily Bronte's sickness and health. And this is something that I wrote about and published on in 2022, also with regard to the sisters' letters. I'm happy to send this paper to anyone if you'd like it. Please just email me afterwards. As I suggested in this article, Charlotte's emotional response to Emily's ill health was a juxtaposition of hope and anxious pleading, for she had persistently sought to persuade Emily to engage in all forms of treatment for tuberculosis, but Emily had consistently refused. Behaviour that I argued was attributable to Emily's disbelief in the effectiveness of Victorian medicine, coupled with her recognition that TB was a fatal disease. So she's got a very, very different view to Anne, and I want to set up that juxtaposition from here. So as I hope to show here, as I've reiterated, now that this same situation is happening again with Anne, Anne's response is completely the opposite of Emily's. Unlike her older sister, she does believe in Victorian medicine, she's mindful of her sister, and she's aware that, that the family have been through quite a lot in the last year. So Sophie, thank you. So if you're not familiar with the images, this is Charlotte Brontë on the left and Anne Brontë on the right, and it's Anne as drawn by Charlotte in approximately 1845, and I think it's a really lovely picture. So as Charlotte Bronte's letters show us, in early January 1849, Anne was very quickly treated by Dr. Wheelhouse, the family doctor, who Charlotte reports in a letter to her friend Ellen Nussey had, quote, ordered the blister to be put on again. Now, medical blistering, in case you're unaware, was a practice that was known as vesiculation. And what that meant was some powder from beetles and other things that were known to irritate the skin would be applied to the skin. A blister would be raised and it would have blood in it, and it would then be withdrawn. It was therefore a kind of purging treatment. And although it sounds like something easy and you might imagine it would happen, take effect very quickly, blistering was something that took place over a couple of hours. So it was quite a long treatment to endure. And the Victorians, of course, as I'm going to show you, and as you're probably aware, they were quite invested in the idea of purging treatments as a real form of effective treatment for all kinds of diseases. Now, Charlotte's use of the term again, that the doctor had ordered the blister to be put on again, in this letter implies that Anne had already begun to implement this treatment, which is also recommended, Sophie, if you wouldn't mind, also recommended in the family's very heavily annotated copy of Graham's Modern Domestic Medicine, in which Dr. Thomas Graham advised that for inflammation of the lungs, quote, blisters to the chest are useful. So she would have had this powder put on her chest and again, all over in different places, and blisters would be kind of like these things would be withdrawing the blood from, and the belief was that this was taking away the illness in some way. Again, it's hard to imagine we wouldn't be doing that today. In the same letter to Ellen Nussey, Charlotte also reports that Anne had already had a dose of cod liver oil, but that it smelt and tastes like train oil. And that's a quote from a letter. Later during the period, Charlotte would explain to Nussey how that product made Anne incredibly nauseous. So from the outset, even with just the family doctor, we can see that Anne is compliant with the very local medical advice that she's been given, and she's doing what she can to alleviate her symptoms. However, at the same time, Sophie, if you wouldn't mind. Patrick Brontë made inquiries for the best doctor in Leeds to come and assess Anne. He wrote that on the 23rd of December, 1848, and she's visited at home by this doctor, Thomas Pridgeon-Teale, who was a founder of the Leeds School of Medicine and a surgeon at the Leeds General Infirmary. Describing Dr. Teale's visit to her publisher a few weeks later, Charlotte wrote in a letter that the, quote, medical man of skills and experience from Leeds had examined Anne with a stethoscope. And I paused there because the stethoscope he's used, and we know he used, was this one, which is the latest form of technology, which gives us an indication that he's somebody who's up to date with medical debates and he's using the latest science and equipment to evaluate patients. Sophie, if you wouldn't mind moving on. So Charlotte says he's using this stethoscope and that he says this is the diagnosis and prognosis. Dr. Teale said it was a case of tubercular consumption with congestion of the lungs. Yet he intimated that the malady had not yet reached so advanced a stage as to cut off all hope. He held out a prospect that a truce or arrest of the disease might yet be procured. Till such truce or arrest could be brought about, he forbade the excitement of travelling, enjoined strict care, and prescribed the use of cod liver oil and carbonate of iron. So we know that she's already taken the cod liver oil. Now, I want to just pause on this because there are really a few important points to kind of discern from this statement in Charlotte's letter. Firstly, Charlotte Bronte's language is remarkably attuned to medical parlance. It's incredibly detailed, and it almost gives the impression in some respects with that kind of repetition of he held, he forbade, he. It's almost a little bit like reported speech, implying in some ways that it's so detailed that she's either got a great memory and could kind of recollect all of this in detail, or somehow maybe some notes have been taken. That's entirely speculative on my part, but it just seems incredibly detailed and specific in terms of reporting what this doctor said. And the practice of taking notes or annotating material is something that we know the family did. If we look at images from Graham's Modern Medicine, we can see Patrick Bronte's annotations on all kinds of aspects of illness and their treatments. Either way, the tone of Charlotte's words and her repeated use of the pronoun he suggests that she hears this information firsthand. Again, I can't prove that, she may not have, but it's, like I said, it seems very difficult to me, logical to me rather. More importantly, the comment articulates Teale's diagnosis and prognosis without ambiguity. The central statement that I've put in bold here, it's a case of tuberculosis of the lungs, yet he intimated that the malady had not yet reached so advanced a stage as to cut off all hope, indicates that in his medical opinion, Anne's case was one that was curable, that there was hope in some way, and that it kind of implies that he's a doctor, therefore, who understands and assesses disease according to the idea at which it's established in a patient's body. Charlotte's phrase, truce and event and arrest of the disease might yet be procured, is also both medical in tone and hopeful. Because it indicates again Teale's view that it might be stopped or she might be cured, since both truce and arrest are in medical terms used to talk about stopping something. If you think of cardiac arrest, we talk about that when the heart has stopped. And of course, I want to suggest that these words therefore are very kind of cautious optimism, and I stress cautious optimism. So in a way, we might want to argue, and I'm not sure I'd go as far as this, given that it's very hard to look at the success of tubercular treatments in the past with an idea to cure as we would understand it today. But certainly in some respect, Teale is perhaps thinking about some kind of either stopping of the disease or a form of remission or cure that is somehow equivalent. Finally, we get Charlotte reporting on the very specific medications, the prescription very clearly. And I want to underline the point that at this moment in time, in January 1849, she's forbidden from travelling. He obviously thinks she's too sick, she's not well enough, and she has to be under very, very strict care. And we know then from subsequent letters that this is what happens, that Anne begins this regimen of these forms of treatment. Sophie, would you click me on? Thank you. Now, despite Charlotte's careful and very precise reporting of Teale's prognosis and recommendations, numerous Bronte scholars have, in my view, inaccurately or overstated the outcomes of Teale's visit, cultivating this thing that I'm calling the death sentence myth. So, for an example, in her early biography of Anne, produced in the 1950s, Winifred Juron writes that, quote, Dr. Teal had told Mr. Brontë that Anne's case was far too advanced for any hope to be entertained. Both lungs were deeply affected. The only treatment he could prescribe was to alleviate suffering and to retard the rapid progress of the disease, but cure at this stage there was none. Similarly, in her otherwise excellent study of Anne's life, Elizabeth Langland writes that the specialist Teal could see there was nothing to be done. In his 1991 biography, A Life of Anne Brontë, Edward Chittum writes that with Dr. Teal's visit, a death sentence had been pronounced, views that he maintains in his updated version of the title from 2022, where he adds the speculative reflection, quote, I sometimes wonder if Anne had already decided that if she was going to die, the happy scene of Mr. Weston's proposal, referring to Agnes Grey and Scarborough, would be her resting place. And Chittum amplifies this point by then going to speak about Anne's final poem in reference to this death sentence myth. In her highly influential book, The Brontes, Juliet Barker similarly declares that Anne had heard her death sentence. And she quotes from the letter I've just quoted from for you, but actually cuts off the part that I have kind of drawn attention to, which is the phrase, the malady has not yet reached so advanced a stage as to cut off all hope. So in some ways, that's a kind of clipping of the historical documentation and maybe misrepresenting the actual assessment. Elsewhere, Nick Holland, in Search of Anne Brontë, writes that the doctor confirmed Anne was in an advanced stage of consumption, and while treatments could perhaps slow down progress of death, there was no hope of a cure. Words which, again, overstate the perspective. And Holland repeats this on his blog, where he also writes that Anne knew there was no hope of a cure after being diagnosed with consumption. And then this is also advanced by Samantha Ellis in her book, Take Courage, Anne Brontë and the Art of Life. And I've not put that quote on here, but mainly because of space. Samantha Ellis writes, the disease was too far advanced for a cure. All Dr. Teal could do was buy Anne time and try and help with the pain. So for me, going back to that kind of the previous, what I showed you, the actual quotation, I think that there's a kind of this slight misrepresentation and a bit of an overstatement going on here. And I think that this has happened, this idea of the death sentence myth has happened for several reasons. Sophie, would you move me on? The first one I'm going to suggest, the reason for this is a methodology issue, that critics are failing to read the Brontes letters situationally and are instead reading and analysing this epistolary material too readily with the benefit of hindsight, i.e. we know Anne dies in 1849, so we then go back to read the letters with that in mind rather than seeing them without or kind of losing and forgetting that we don't know, they didn't know what was going to come and how that was going to unfold. When we centre the retrospective knowledge of Anne's death in May 1849, we obscure a more accurate reading of the letters in their totality and kind of overlook the opportunity to understand Anne's assessment of her illness as it unfolded on a day-to-day basis. This also runs the risk of cultivating misleading assumptions about particular activities. In Anne's case, the idea that she goes to Scarborough to die, or that she goes to Scarborough because she wants to see it one last time, and it's all kind of a sentimental choice for her to go to Scarborough, and I'm going to challenge that in a moment. Sophie, if you could hit me again. So the second reason I think that we have this death sentence myth is a kind of presentism. We know that by today's medical standards, Dr. Teal's assessment and his prescription are definitely not going to have helped Anne. There's no way tubercular patients, you know, they'd be after those antibiotics. They're not going to be after cod liver oil and iron or blistering or anything like that. But again, it ignores this historical context. I think it's really helpful to remember here that it would be many years until Robert Koch would identify and describe the bacillus that caused tuberculosis. That doesn't happen until 1882. And as Patrick Bronte's comment indicates, you know, Dr. Teal is perceived as the best doctor in Leeds. He was an established and respected medic of his day. In fact, he's so trusted that we know from the Brontes' other letters that Patrick Bronte goes to him to consult him for his own health because he struggles from bronchitis and other things throughout his life. And that Arthur Bell Nichols, who would go on to marry Charlotte Bronte, he also goes to consult Dr. Teal when he thinks he has tuberculosis, just before when he's kind of courting Charlotte and wants her to marry him. So thirdly, Sophie, if you'd hit me again, I think that beyond, the kind of death sentence myths, that another reason we have for this is because scholars have relied on another source written by Ellen Nussey, which was written quite some time later. So in what the Brontë scholar C.W. Hatfield describes as some notes, which were made at a later date, Nussey claimed that after Dr. Teal's departure, Patrick Brontë walked towards the patient, quote, drew Anne towards him and said, "My dear little Anne," that was all but understood. And that then afterwards, Charlotte told her that Dr. Teal had said something different, that he'd said to her, the disease had progressed too far for a cure, and that he kind of was sending Ella Nussey home. Now, Nussey's comments are reproduced by Hatfield in 1932, and they've been reproduced in subsequent biographies over and over again, including the ones I referred to by Winifred Giron and Edward Chitham. And they both give credence to Nussey because she's an eyewitness, and that's absolutely fine, and you might understand why. But as I've said, those notes are made sometime later after the fact. Charlotte Bronte's account, which I quoted to you with the prognosis and diagnosis I'm relying on, happens at the time. And you can see it's completely kind of in conflict in one way or another. Since then, the Bronte's letters have been comprehensively cohered and transcribed by the fabulous Margaret Smith. And with regards to Ellen Nussey, Smith is very clear in her assessment throughout the letters that sometimes she's often mistaken in her recollection. She says her memory is sometimes at fault. And she actually cites Charlotte's letter from the 22nd of January that I quoted to you as being a more accurate one. And I'm inclined to align with Smith on that. So any scholars relying on Ellen Nussey's account are kind of maybe kind of overlooking this other letter that exists. I don't have, sorry, Sophie, I don't have time to talk about this final one, but I'm happy to talk about it in questions afterwards. That the death sentence myth is really cultivated when we look at Anne's final poem, using Charlotte's edited version of that poem and not Anne's actual original version of the poem. So moving on from this idea about why the death sentence myth exists, thank you, Sophie. If we kind of think about Anne's actions in the moment, so think about them situationally, we can think about her behaviour from January in a slightly different way. Anne Brontë is aware that tuberculosis can kill. She's a realist. She doesn't receive her diagnosis without kind of a recognition that people die from this disease. However, as I hope to show you, she is interested in a number of treatments. She's using them. And I think that she takes on board the sentiment in this statement here that I've put up again for you, that this idea that hope is not all gone here, that there is hope if she follows the prescription very specifically. So what treatments then do the letters show that Anne invests in? Well, according to, or rather in addition to the blistering that I've discussed with you already, the correspondence also indicates, as I've also indicated, that Anne begins this regular regimen of cod liver oil and iron, which Charlotte reported made Anne nauseous. But we also know from the letters that Anne began to regularly use a product called Godball's vegetable balsam. And this is a product that was developed by Nathaniel Godbald in 1785, and it was licensed by George III as, quote, the cure of consumption and disease in the lungs, end quote. Charlotte wrote in a letter that the balsam was, quote, the first medicine which has had a good effect, and that Anne wished to persevere with it for a time. On Teal's recommendation, we also know that changes are made to the siblings' sleeping arrangements in the family home, such that Anne and Charlotte would sleep apart, and that the temperature in Anne's room would be kept at a constant. We know that Anne purchased some cork soles to protect herself from the cold flagstone floor in the family home. And most importantly, we also know that she purchases a particular product, a 30s respirator. Sophie, if you'd hit me again on the next slide, thank you. So the specificity of Charlotte's description of a 30s respirator, my research has led me to think that it's this. This is an 1830s respirator, and it was created by the British surgeon Julius Jeffreys. Now, Jeffreys creates this respirator, and doesn't it look like a COVID mask, everybody? It's developed with the aim of protecting people already suffering from TB and asthma, which we also know that Anne has, and any other respiratory diseases from the changing weather. And in one letter, Charlotte writes that Anne is looking forward to using it outside. So she's speaking of a time in the future, thinking that this will be something that will be of benefit to her. Now, we know that Teal had forbidden any excitement and to stop Anne going outside at the present. So we kind of begin to get an awareness that this is something that she's thinking of. She's thinking of the future. And again, thinking, what can I do? What can I purchase? How can I support myself moving forward? And we also know, and I'll come back to this, that Anne is definitely impacted by the weather. We see this consistently in the Bronte's letters from the earliest surviving letters, in fact. So finally, and perhaps most importantly, among these range of treatments, at this point anyway, an analysis of the correspondence indicates that the communication with Teal is ongoing, although that correspondence is missing. And that in addition to what's mentioned, there must have been correspondence in which Teal also recommends hydrotherapy, but there are no particulars on that because we don't have the letters. We only know that Charlotte reports that he said this, but where that documentation is, we'll never know. So the suggestion that some letters are missing is reinforced by the fact that at some point in March or April, Dr. Teal amends his view. So the earlier view from January, when he had forbidden Anne from excitement and travelling, and subsequently changes his mind and consented to Anne in implementing a change of air treatment. Sophie, if you'd move forward. Because we know that on April the 12th, Charlotte wrote to Ellen Nussey that she had consulted Dr. Teal and wrote, he does not object to the change of air treatment and recommended Scarborough, which was Anne's own choice. And again, I want to labour on this because this challenges the idea that Anne goes to Scarborough for sentimental reasons. In fact, we can see from this that it is first and foremost a medical recommendation by this doctor. And even the way that Charlotte frames this here, which was Anne's own choice, means that her choice comes secondary to the recommendation of going to this particular resort, which is for tubercular patients. So the idea that she goes or chosen or wanted to go to Scarborough for sentimental reason comes from the fact that we know she'd worked there and that it's a prominent location in her novel Agnes Grey. But as I'm suggesting, this is not the case. We can see here that this is clearly part of a medical treatment and it's picked because it is a particular resort supporting consumptive patients. So writing to Ellen to accompany her and Charlotte to Scarborough later in or during this time, Anne is clear that she wants Ellen to join her as a companion, not as a nurse. Sophie, if you'd hit the next slide, please. But she writes to Ellen that her eagerness to go as soon as possible is because of this. The doctors say that change of air or removal to a better climate would hardly ever fail of success if, in consumptive cases, the remedy were taken in time. But the reason why there are so many disappointments is that it is generally deferred till it is too late. Now, I would not commit this error. Under these circumstances, I think there is no time to be lost. Now, in the wider letter I've quoted from here, Anne describes her symptoms to Ellen, telling her that she feels much better than she had done in January. And though she is clearly symptomatic, she strongly feels that there is no time to be lost, precisely because of Dr. Teal's suggestion that if this remedy, a change of air, is taken in time, then it would lead to success, that it would hardly ever fail. So again, the doctor and patient seem to have this hope and investment in this is going to lead to some form of cure. So these letters then help us to situate Anne's view of her illness and her experience in the moment, showing us that she was cautiously hopeful about her treatment and prognosis at that time. And so far from being resigned to death, her approach to illness is more reliably characterised as independent, proactive with regard to treatment, and one that centres both her family and self-care, such that, as Charlotte describes her in another letter, she's a model patient. But Charlotte Bronte's own emotional response to her sister's ill health is more complex and turbulent. As you might expect, having lost two siblings in close succession, she is replete with anxiety throughout the period. Such was Charlotte's anxiety that in the January, Sophie can go to the next slide, Charlotte had sought reassurance about Dr. Teal's diagnosis and his prognosis of Anne by seeking a second opinion. She had written to Dr. John Forbes, shown here, who was the founder of the British and Foreign Medical Review, requesting his review of the case and his perspective on the efficacy of Dr. Teal's suggested treatments. And the fact that Charlotte does that, I think, is another reason why we can maybe challenge Ellen Nussey's recollection about there being nothing to be done, because Charlotte is getting a kind of confirmation of what she's heard at that time. Now, in his reply, Dr. Forbes reassures Charlotte of Teal's course of action and recommendations, stating that the remedies were precisely those he would have recommended himself. However, unlike Dr. Teal, who indicated to the family, as I've quoted to you several times, the malady had not yet reached so advanced a stage as to cut off all hope, indicated that there is hope, a statement from which I also think Anne has taken hope. Dr. Forbes, in his reply, is slightly more moderated in his perspective. He cautions Charlotte against entertaining sanguine hopes of recovery. So here is a good example of how we see 19th century doctors and medics debating the outcomes for particular patients and treatments. And of course, it's important to remember that Forbes is just doing this in correspondence. He hasn't assessed Anne. He doesn't know how she actually is in person and isn't dealing with her directly. But it shows that there are these debates around medicine towards tuberculosis at this time. Now, as I suggested earlier, my recent research published elsewhere thought extensively about Charlotte's battle with false hope during Emily's final months. And this is only amplified during Anne's illness, coupled with the pain of Emily's passing and Forbes' explicit caution against hopes of recovery to contend with. She is anxious. We see her going up and down, changing from letter to letter in how she feels. Among the many emotional conflicts about Anne's health and deterioration that Charlotte articulates is her concern that there is a correlation between the weather, climate, and Anne's health, something which is really important with this particular treatment that they're now thinking about, this change of air, because it's precisely air and the weather that seems to impact Anne the most. For Charlotte, then, this treatment cultivates a lot of anxiety. And we can see that across the period, she writes of how changes in the weather negatively impact Anne. So Sophie, if you'd move to the next slide, and these are some of the quotes. So in a letter dated the 22nd of January from 1849, she writes to Ellen that Anne really did seem to be a little better during some mild days last week. But then she knows just a week later that the change to frost has told upon her. She suffers more of late. By February, she's writing to William Smith Williams that Anne continues a little better. The mild weather suits her. But in March, and I haven't put this quotation on the slide, she says, my sister has been something worse since I wrote last. We had nearly a week of frost and the change has tried her. And though Charlotte tells Ellen that Anne is very much looking forward to deriving benefits from the change of air treatment, Charlotte herself is really unsure about it, concluding one letter to Ellen with a poignant statement, and it comes as a kind of PS almost. She says, quote, I long for the moment to come when the experiment of the sea air will be tried. Will it do her good? Question mark. I cannot tell. I can only wish. End quote. Now, in context, if I can go to the next slide, for the Victorians, a change of air treatment was the preferred therapy for tuberculosis, because it was believed that a lifestyle and climate conducive to the disease would slow about its progress and bring about the truce or arrest that Teal had spoken of. The influential Dr. James Clark wrote extensively on the subject, publishing a treatise on pulmonary consumption in 1835, in which he documents his medical experience of travelling with patients as a cure for TB. In 1841, he followed this with his book, The Sanative Influence of Climate, in which he offered explicit travel directives for those suffering from consumption, again, to either bring about a truce or an arrest of the disease in the same way. Now, as we have seen, Anne receives medical approval from Dr. Teal to travel in the April or May. We can't be sure because of that missing correspondence. But Charlotte, in another letter, writes that that was to take place 6 to 8 weeks later. So he's saying wait until 6 to 8 weeks. And that we also have seen that Scarborough is his recommendation. As I've mentioned, critics often see this as Anne's final days and this trip as a sentimental journey. She goes to Scarborough, wants to make use of the facilities, but really she's there to die. That's her wish, but not before she enjoys a donkey ride on the beach, holding the rein herself to educate the actual driver on how to look after the animal. So I want to challenge this idea. I'm not changing any of those facts, but I want to suggest that this isn't part of her going to die. This isn't sentimental last kind of things to do in Scarborough before she passes away. I want to suggest that this is all part of Anne following medical advice, and that if we look at some of her behaviours during this time, we can correlate them to medical advice on taking the waters in Scarborough. So Sophie, if I can get you to move on to the next slide, hit thingy again, because I think some wording will come up. Thank you very much. So this is the final part of my paper. We know that Anne bathed when she had gone to Scarborough, but no one can accurately identify the specific location where she goes to take the waters. Winifred Giron suggested that the venue on Vernon Place was where the baths attended, was where she attended baths a few days before she died. And in his book, Walking the Invisible, Michael Stewart discussed with Wendy Pratt, the playwright, the other possible locations for where Anne takes the waters. And Pratt suggests that it was Travis Bath House because that's directly opposite the lodgings where Anne stayed. And together they muse on the garden gate, surmising that that's where Anne is known to have collapsed. However, the medical advice at the time is actually quite specific in its recommendations, with most prominent advice coming from Dr. William Alexander's A Treatise on the Various Modes of Bathing, with the analysis of the mineral springs of Scarborough and their medicinal uses, and this comes out in 1833. Now, given that Dr. Teal recommends Scarborough and that we know he's using kind of modern recommendations, I suggest that he's probably used this in the past or is using this as part of his recommendation. Now, in the book, Alexander is very specific about the kinds of disorders that would benefit from taking the water. And any of you who've been to Scarborough, you know that it's kind of separated into the south and the north cliff. And this is also how the medical practitioners write about it. They write about the south well at the south cliff and the north well on Scarborough's north cliff. And the remedies to either of those locations are quite specific. Patients, when they go there, need to, depending on which one they go to, they need to do the same thing. They need to ingest the water, not just dip in it, which I think a lot of people maybe think is what's happening. So taking the waters, again, becomes a purging treatment. The idea is they take the waters, ingest it and get in it, and then that becomes part of the purge to get rid of the illness. Now today, we wouldn't dream of doing this to a tubercular patient. In fact, if we sent someone to drink seawater, we'd know it would just dehydrate them and make them feel unwell. So asking a frail tubercular patient to do this is likely going to induce shock and make them a lot worse. Nonetheless, medicine at the time is advocating this, and Dr. Alexander recommends the South Well for a number of disorders, including tuberculosis. And he says this: in larger doses, taking the waters has a speedy operation on the intestinal canal. It's a convenient remedy. End quote. He goes on to state how a glass of water every day should be taken for some time, and that this can, quote, produce the most permanent and desired effects, even when very powerful other medicines have been found not to answer or have only given temporary relief, end quote. Accordingly, the most common prescription is, quote, 2, 3, or even 4 half pints taken at proper intervals and repeated daily are required. So that's a lot of seawater, a lot of water from these locations to be taken on. And in his other specific recommendation for ingesting the spa waters, he recommends that the liquid ought not to be warmed, as in its cold natural state, it is better for the stomach and for the body, but that it should be taken in the early part of the morning and with exercise in intervals of drinking. So again, very specific about how someone needs to behave. He recommends that if you take the purging treatment in the morning, that you then have a breakfast of, quote, not tea and coffee because they are objectionable, but milk and bread or cocoa or chocolate are nutritious and generally recommended for those drinking the waters. Now, to end my paper, I can't be conclusive with what I'm about to say, but given Dr. Alexander's medical advice and some of Anne's known activities, I think it's possible that this is exactly what she was doing. Why do I think that? Well, we know that she arrives on Saturday, that when she gets there on the first morning after her first evening on Saturday the 26th, she immediately goes to the spa baths, and it's reported that she was exhausted on the way back and fell at the garden gate. And I think perhaps, again, if we're thinking about a frail tubercular patient, as I mentioned, taking on and ingesting, different kinds of seawater, then of course that's going to make somebody very frail collapse. We know it will dehydrate you, cause someone to feel shock, likely go into a kind of fainting episode. We also know that on the afternoon on that same day, she goes back to the beach, and that we know she, quote, drove on the sand for an hour with this donkey, and that she took the reins herself. So we can see her taking the air, but it seems such an unusual thing for someone to do in such a frail state. So is it perhaps that Anne saw this as a form of exercise? Dr. Alexander's recommendations to take exercise between intervals of drinking the water. And then on the Sunday, we know that despite her frail state, she goes to the beach again and walks, asking Charlotte and Ellen to go off and leave her. that she found a bench and then took in the air. Juliet Barker writes that on that morning, Anne had, quote, her breakfast of boiled milk prepared especially for her. And Ellen Nussey in her private notes writes that it was bread and milk. Either way, given this medical advice to take milk and chocolate and those kind of things, this leaves over the possibility that that breakfast is particularly an antidote to the purging treatment that would have been taking effect on her stomach and her bowels, because as Alexander advised, this is nutritious, this is part of the treatment, this will make the patient feel better. So that's completely speculative on my part. It's far from conclusive. And I need to do more on this. So if anyone's got any suggestions, please do let me know. I'm keen not to add to myths, but to think about the correlation between behaviour and treatments here. Either way, of course, we know it was all too late. It's on the last day that state changes in the morning and a doctor is called. And from all the reminiscences we have at the time, it seems only now that Anne begins to understand just how ill she is. Because according to Ellen Nussey, and Sophie, if you could flick forward to my last slides, Anne has an exchange with a doctor that was made with perfect composure. She begged him to say how long he thought she might live, not to fear speaking the truth, for she was not afraid to die. The doctor reluctantly admitted that the angel of death had already arrived and that life was ebbing fast. She thanked him for the truth. Now, again, I want to note the word in here. Anne is asking how long she has to live, not how soon she has before she dies. But it's the doctor who's reluctant in his admission to say, well, time has run out and I'm afraid time is up. We know from Ellen's diary that on that morning, quote, at around 11, she, Anne, surprised us by questioning the possibility of reaching home if we prepared at once. So this, it seems to me, kind of reinforces the fact that Anne doesn't go to Scarborough to die, that when she realises she's really got a lot worse, she thinks about making her way home, but it's only the fact that she's so ill at this point that she can't make it home. So this calls into question again this idea that she goes there solely to die. Anne's final emotional response reinforces the pragmatism with which she had approached her ill health. Knowing that death with it was imminent, she prayed, placing a blessing, quote, first upon her sister, then upon her friend Ellen, to whom she said, be a sister in my stead, end quote. Even in those final months, Anne's concern was not solely for herself, understanding that she would now, that her sister Charlotte would now be the only surviving child of the original 6 Brontë children. And as Ellen indicates, when Anne finally passed, quote, the welled-up grief of her sister burst forth in agonised strength. In retrospect, we know that Anne was frail, likely far too frail to be undertaking this visit. But what I hope to have done here is to complicate the narrative a little bit and to show that far from accepting her illness passively as a death sentence or with some kind of saintly godliness, that Anne actually had far more agency in her final months than we give her credit to. And I hope that with this shift in perspective, we can begin to see Anne Brontë as a young woman who wasn't ready to die, but as a young woman who was fighting to live. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. O'Callaghan, for your insightful and thought-provoking presentation and contribution to rethinking Anne Brontë in tuberculosis and the Victorian medicine. Thank you very much.